The boom in the creation of companies launched in the West based on assets sourced in Asia signals China's galloping speed of innovation. On the latest BioCentury This Week podcast, we'll discuss the so-called NewCo model, who the players are, what the assets are, and where this trend is heading. Plus, we'll have a look inside FDA as Trump 2.0 continues to shake up Washington. And Vertex, an old biotech headed into a new commercial territory with its approval for a pain medication. I'm Jeff Cranmer, executive editor here at BioCentury, and joining me to discuss all of these topics are my colleagues
Simon Fishburne, editor-in-chief.
Selena Koch, executive editor.
And Steve Usden, Washington editor.
Okay, and if you like what you hear today, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, as well as our sister podcast, The BioCentury Show. That's available as a video on YouTube, our YouTube channel. So BioCentury has identified 13 companies that were launched in the West based on assets sourced in Asia, at this point primarily China, beginning with the establishment of a company called Aerovent in 2021. 3 years later, the formation of these NewCos has kicked into high gear after GSK bought NewCo Alios for $1 billion. 56 investors in total have joined a NewCo syndicate. And to show you the speed at which this is all unfolding, 5 NewCos were formed in a 10-day span this January. Simone, you had a great piece last week. Tell us what you are seeing with this trend.
Right. Well, thanks, Jeff. Listeners, faithful listeners to the podcast will have heard us talk already about the NewCo model, which we're actually going to be digging into quite a lot at the upcoming East-West conference in Singapore, and probably more throughout the year, in fact. And so what we wanted to do was to say, okay, what are the companies so far that fit this model? And then look at what the drivers are. And it's extremely interesting. So I just have to make one caveat, and you know this, Jeff, because you've been out and about talking to people. Different people have slightly different definitions of what they put in this bucket of NewCos. People talk a lot about the NewCo model, but everybody draws the line somewhere else. And what we think is the most faithful representation of this is to talk about companies that have been created in the West, new companies created in the West, based on assets that derive from Asia, or as you point out, in all of the 13 cases we found, so far, they're from China. But we do know, Jeff, that people are out and about scouting a bunch of Asia companies. And we'll talk about this probably today and in future episodes. But so I think that it's really important to look at the different technologies and what does it signal about what's going on there. So you've given this sort of timeline where there was one or two, one very early in, 2021, and then a trickle in a couple more in 2023, sort of accelerating through 2024, and then we like 5 within 10 days in 2025. Right now, so why is this different from, people have historically, VCs have gone to other places, found assets and brought them to create companies in the West. This is part of a wave that we've talked about of East-West deals, and that reverses the trend that actually founded the whole, I don't know if founded is right, but created a huge boom for the China biotech ecosystem, right, where they used to license assets from the West to create companies in China. This is the reverse. I think a couple of really important things are relevant here. One is that almost all of these companies, all but 2, have got some clinical data, right? And that clinical data might be in a different indication from where the NewCo plans to develop the asset, but that is massively de-risking for investors. So the way you have to look at this is, why is a US investor investing in a technology from China when they've got plenty on their doorstep? And that's what they've been doing the last few years. And the reason is that they've got incredibly high quality assets coming out of China now that are really quite de-risked. So I want to talk about one more thing here, because I know you want to jump in. If you look at the technologies, you'll see that 5 of these assets that were licensed were in autoimmune diseases. They were bispecific antibodies. Another 2 were in obesity. And what's relevant about the autoimmune antibodies is that this is following a trend, which is really a field that's basically 2 years old, or 2.5 years old or something, that comes from George Schett's finding, I think published late 2022, where CAR T cells or CD19 directed CAR T cells could be used in cancer, could be highly effective. In that case, it was in lupus. Everybody jumped into that field, started to use these technologies as well as bispecifics in autoimmune diseases. What you see is China companies jumping on that trend, creating real value driving assets and licensing them to the West or to Western VCs. So what that tells you is the speed at which research is happening in China and their ability to generate clinical data very fast. And that, I think, is going to keep going. I pointed out to these just to show that there's nothing, these are very, very hot assets. The obesity ones are as well, that are being licensed, and China is incredibly competitive right now.
Are the assets getting more innovative that are in these NewCo deals, or has that always been the case from the get-go?
I think that's a fair question. I mean, the very earliest ones, 2 of the earliest ones, the first 4, were in cancer. Okay. And it's actually funny that 2 of the first 4, so none of the last 7 have been in cancer, in fact. Okay. They've sort of switched to autoimmune diseases. And the earlier ones were small molecules, and there were a couple of bispecifics in immunity and inflammation, which was a pretty hot area as well. But yes, I think to answer your question, it's almost as if they're sort of becoming more leading edge. Yes.
Well, I don't want to be entirely focused on the NewCo model here because that just reflects where, well, the industry in general is going, but also China. A few years ago, when deals to take in Chinese assets into the West were rising, they were almost all for cancer, and there were antibody modalities. And now we've seen other kinds of deals outside of cancer and autoimmune diseases, outside of antibodies, just in general. Not necessarily to found a NewCo, right? So it's all part of this bigger kind of growth trajectory within that region.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the reason I focus on this autoimmune area is because it is so new. Globally, it's so new. And you're right, lots of people are rushing in. I think it shows that, and I don't know, Steve, if you want to talk about this, we know that a lot of these trials, in China, you can do these investigator-initiated trials, means you can get things tested in humans faster than you can in the West.
Well, yeah. So, and then the issue, of course, I think what you're implying is that FDA has said that it won't accept China-only data as supporting registration of new drugs. But the China data does 2 things. One, serves as proof of concept, because if something works in Chinese patients, then clearly it's going to work in patients in other places. So that's a massive amount of de-risking. Also, China data can be part of a package that's used to support approvals in the United States. So that data is going to be extremely valuable. And as you said, it's much easier to do these kind of trials in China than the United States. They're regulated more like hospital procedures than new drugs, which may be actually a more realistic way to look at some of these therapies. And they're moving very quickly.
So one of the common threads that I find interesting as well, as Simone pointed out in her piece, the very first of these companies was led by Bing Yao, and he is a veteran of MedImmune and Vela Bio, and he saw this early opportunity to take China assets to the West to develop. Yao led Vela through its $3 billion plus acquisition by Horizon. So there's sort of this theme of big name CEOs who have done billion-dollar deals. We have Ken Song, who sold his radiopharma company Raise to BMS, I believe. And then we have the team behind Turning Point, another company that was in a big takeout, going into the solid tumor company Avenzo.
Jeff, I just want to jump in because you did say this, but you went through it super fast. And I actually want to make sure that we give Bing Yao his creds here, because this first company was in 2021, as we pointed out. And our reporting at the time, and you can include this in the show notes, right? Our reporting at the time was him saying there is a bunch of really good assets in China that could be used. And it was another 2 years before another company was spun out on this basis. But he really did see this potential way ahead, or at least articulate seeing this potential way ahead. And credit to him. And he's remained very, very active. Right, as you point out.
In those 2 years, right, then just licensing deals between Western companies and Chinese ones have been on the rise. So why do one versus another, the NewCo versus a different kind of deal?
I think that's a really good question. The way I look at it actually is that what you had, and a lot of those deals were led by pharma companies. I mean, some of them were biotechs, but a lot of them were led by pharma companies who already had branches or people scouting in China and in Asia. They were basically ahead of the game, is the way I think about that. And they had a lot of money, as we know, looking for specific assets. What's interesting now is that you've got VCs getting in the game. And Jeff, I know you've done a story and are doing more on the VCs in there. I think it was led, you'll fill me in here, Jeff, but the initial VCs had China ties, I think. And now what you're seeing is more and more Western VCs go, I don't know if you want to call it FOMO or if you want to call it waking up to the potential there. But that lag did take VCs a little while. You're right, Selena.
It did. And I think there's a lot of different factors going on right now, Selena. I think one is the ongoing bear market in China. I think China biotech's first bear market. It's been more prolonged than the one here, and companies can't raise money. So this is a way for companies to hive off assets and fund their pipelines or repay some of their investors. It's also at a time of increasing geopolitical tension. So this allows some assets to be pulled into the West and, get off to a global market, perhaps on better footing.
Right. You're saying those geopolitical tensions might be making your conventional deals a little bit harder, or is it more like China's just bursting at the seams with all these assets now, and there's more there than are getting taken up in other kinds of deals?
Yeah, I think those are really relevant questions. My sense is that a lot of this at the beginning was driven by biotechs, as Jeff has pointed out. There wasn't a lot of money there. They and maybe their investors are, seeking investors from the West and other ways to bring in some revenue. At the same time, I think that's shifted. And we know this because of our conferences. We have Western investors now reaching out to us saying, can I go to this conference now in 6 months, in a year, whatever? They are scouting because of what you suggested is a large amount of innovation coming out of China. So I think that this is a two-way now street of people looking for investors and investors looking for opportunities, whereas it may not have started out that way. It may have been more unidirectional to start with.
Now we're going to jump to Steve in just a minute, but I did want to get back to the investor piece that you raised, Simone. The most active players so far in the NewCo model are two of the most experienced investors in China who've been there the longest, OrbiMed, which has done 6 deals, and Lilly Asia Ventures, which has done 4 deals. Hillhouse Capital, another global PE firm with deep Asian roots, has done 1 deal, but it was the first, and it led it. Lilly Asia Ventures was founded in 2008 by Darren Carroll of Eli Lilly. Lilly Asia Ventures is no longer part of Eli Lilly, but I believe that the pharma is an LP in the fund. And OrbiMed, which has co-led 3 of the NewCo deals, it opened its Shanghai office in 2007, I believe, and that office was co-led by Jonathan Wang and David Wang. Another big player in these deals is Boyu, founded in 2011. It's one of the most well-connected traditional Chinese public and private investors. And we mentioned Alios before. That's the company that was sold for $1 billion to GSK maybe a year after it was founded. That company, 4 blue chip U.S. investors in its $245 million Series A. That's Atlas, Bain, RA Capital, and Sofinova Investments. You also see Forbion, one of Europe's most deep-pocketed biotech VCs, in the deal, and Bain has since gone on to make 2 more NewCo investments, with the other firms making 1 more of each so far. So check out the analysis in BioCentury. We'll drop a link in the show notes. And hey, our BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Biopharma Summit, which we put on with the help of McKinsey, is just around the corner. It'll be in Singapore in early March. We'd love to have you there. We'll take a quick break so you can hear about it.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the 4th East-West Biopharma Summit in Singapore. This March, BioCentury, Bay Helix, and Insights partner McKinsey & Company return to Singapore for the 4th East-West Biopharma Summit. This year's theme, how to globalize Asia innovation from cross-border deals to the NewCo model. Meet key players from across Asia's emerging arc of innovation, including China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, and Southeast Asia. Don't wait, deals are closing every week. Register today at biocenturyeastwest.com.
All right, we're back. And now I want to turn to Steve, because Steve's been talking to people inside of FDA who used to be at FDA about what is going on at the agency. Steve, what are you hearing?
What I'm hearing is that the agency could lose up to 20% of its workforce over the next year if things aren't done to shield it from these things that are being done across government, right? And many of the people who are likely to leave are the ones who are going to find it easiest to find jobs in the private sector. That's biostatisticians, that's clinical reviewers who have been there for a decade or more and have the most experience. It's experts on the application of artificial intelligence to clinical trial design and clinical trial conduct. And those things will be really, really devastating. Another really important point, and something I'm going to be writing about today, is that employees who are being paid through user fees are not exempt from these policies. The hiring freeze applies to user fee funded positions. The incentives that are being used to try to get people to take early retirement, the potential for laying off staff who have been working for a year or less, all of those things apply across the board, regardless of whether someone is being paid from user fees or not, which is something that should be infuriating, I think, to industry, because getting rid of these people or incentivizing them to leave causes difficulties. It erodes FDA's ability to conduct its work, but it doesn't save the government a nickel. And there are broader concerns about, for example, the legality of the buyout offers that have been offered and things like that. But regardless of that, and however that gets resolved, there are these bigger pressures, and the general mode of the Trump administration is to try to hollow out government, to try to get as many people, regardless of what they're doing or the importance of their jobs, to leave as quickly as possible. And there's a real concern at FDA, and I should say at other public health agencies, that this is going to have really detrimental effects if they're not protected from it. There is a possibility of them being protected from it. In the first Trump administration, then FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb managed to carve out FDA from some of the things that were done to other agencies. And it's possible that this could be done here. I think that's one of the reasons why they're moving so quickly, because they're trying to get kind of facts on the ground in place before Marty Makary is confirmed as commissioner, because they know that once somebody takes over an agency like this, they're going to see that it's really important to protect their people and to protect their mission.
Steve, just quickly, what's happening with RFK Jr.'s nomination process? And I've heard something about tariffs over the weekend. How might that affect biotech?
So RFK, the Senate Finance Committee, is going to vote on whether to send his nomination to the full floor. That vote is going to happen on Tuesday. It's scheduled to happen on Tuesday. The betting is that he's more likely than not to be confirmed, but there's still a real chance that he'll be rejected. I think I said last time when I said something about this on the podcast, this is not very helpful. It's really kind of a toss-up, but there's a very real chance that he will be confirmed. There's a possibility that he won't. About tariffs, the impact of tariffs on biopharma is very uncertain. We don't know how they're going to function. For example, will they apply to APIs or just to final products? That would make an enormous difference. If there are increased costs for inputs or imported products, will manufacturers be able to pass them on to payers, or will the IRA's penalties for exceeding overall inflation make that impossible or economically infeasible? I'm going to be looking into all this in the coming days as we get a better understanding of the nuts and bolts of the tariffs, and frankly, as we get a better understanding of whether they will actually go into effect and whether they might be dialed back or changed from the initial announcements.
All right, thanks for that update, Steve. Let's turn to Vertex now. FDA's approval of the company's new acute pain therapy ushers in the first new therapeutic mechanism for pain management in many years. Here to talk about it is Selena. Selena.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, it is a scientific achievement. It's a new target, and this target is a member of a family of voltage-gated sodium channels that drug developers have had their eye on for a while in the context of pain, because there are genetic mutations, alterations out there in the population that influence pain states. And they are responsible for the sort of action potential firing of certain types of neurons, in particular, the ones that transmit pain signaling. The question, of course, for Vertex's future growth, right, is if it can turn the scientific achievement into a commercial success. The approval last week is for moderate to severe acute pain. So a lot of things are under that broad umbrella. In the phase 3 trials that it ran, it tested it in post-surgery pain, 2 different post-surgery indications, but this approval is broader. Okay. And so up until now, Vertex has pretty much had the lock on the cystic fibrosis market, and it knows how to market to those patients, right? That's a specialty model. It's a rare disease. Here you have something where they're going to have to, it has its potential uses span in hospital, retail pharmacy, and across the country. It's just a very different kind of a launch than I think they've had to do before.
Selena, thanks for that. You've covered 2 really important angles on this. One is pain. The pain field has long awaited a new mechanism that is not opioid, not NSAID, didn't get pulled from the market like Vioxx, Sort of since then, there's just been this sort of big gap, really, and we will see where this fits, let's say, should we say, in that. But you're right that it's complicated because it does depend on their ability to commercialize it and what they charge for it. So, of course, it's important for Vertex and their own model and their own growth, of course, beyond their core of cystic fibrosis and so on, and how well they commercialize that. We know they know how to commercialize drugs very well. But I think price is probably also a big part of this because, other pain medications are not expensive. What do you know about that, Selena?
Price is definitely a big piece of the story. There's no getting around it. They are going to have to make their case to payers, to hospital P&T committees, so on and so forth, all the various customers, that it's worth, paying for a branded drug in the context of a generics market, especially when the efficacy is no better than opioids. At least they tested against an opioid in one of their phase 3 trials, and it performed about as well as that one, but beat placebo. So it didn't knock it out of the park in terms of being obviously more effective, but they're hoping to position it so that, if a patient is on NSAIDs and acetaminophen, and that's just not enough for them, they're hoping that the next thing that gets turned to is their drug before moving it on to an opiate. We will see. It kind of puts the need to deal with the opioid crisis, pits that against cost constraints, right? I don't know that anyone knows exactly how that's going to play out just yet.
Thanks for that, Selena. It's going to be interesting to watch how that plays out. And we'll have Vertex's CSO, David Altshuler, on our sister podcast, the BioCentury Show, in the next month or 2. He'll be in conversation with Simone. So it will be interesting to hear what he has to say. Okay, that's it for this week. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury this week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music. while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.